All right, great. Looks like we're all set up. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the second of three virtual information sessions that we will be offering this week for vendors to discuss changes to our rate structure and other 2024 programming changes for MRS. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes I wanted to go through. First, providing notice to you that this session is being recorded. If you speak or turn on your camera during the session, that will be part of the recording. Following this session, we plan to use either this video or one of the other two sessions this week to send a follow-up email to all registrants and also to post on our website for anyone who couldn't make these sessions. We encourage questions and comments throughout. Inside of Zoom, we have turned on both the chat and the Q&A feature. They work a little bit differently, but they're both pretty intuitive, and I think you'll manage just fine. We encourage use of either one, whatever one you're more comfortable with. We welcome all comments and questions. We'll do our best to address questions throughout the session as they come in. We also have a dedicated times throughout the presentation, which we will pause and address any questions that have piled up in the queue. Third, we do have closed captioning. We have a CART provider present. So if you want to see captioning inside of the session, please just click the CC captioning button on the bottom of your Zoom interface. We also have sign language interpreters present. You don't need to do anything on your end to see the interpreter. They should be showing either above or below me in the gallery right now. But if you have any issues with interpreters and you'd like to use that as an accommodation, please just reach out to me in chat or Q&A and we'll work with you to resolve any issues. We can jump. Thanks, Mark. So before we begin in full, I would like to thank especially MRS vendors who are in attendance and took the time out of their day to hear our information and provide some feedback. MRS recognizes vendors as an irreplaceable partner in the VR process in Michigan, and we have a strong desire to have a working relationship with vendors to improve outcomes for persons with disabilities in Michigan. That said, we recognize your time is very precious, so it's my commitment to you. We will stay focused on the agenda today. Stay focused on pertinent information, and we're scheduled for 2 hours. We will finish on or before that 2-hour mark. I make that commitment to you. Today's information, including the increased rates that we're going to discuss and future 2024 programming changes, were developed in part in response to information provided by vendors in public sessions such as these that have happened over the last couple of years, as well as through individual conversation with vendors. We heard your feedback over that time, and hopefully today and the information covered today will be an important step in addressing some of those concerns that have been raised to MRS. Namely, and I don't want to bury the lead, MRS is introducing significant rate increases for a wide range of services based on the vendor input we received on the cost of doing business to provide those services and what is needed to promote a healthy VR vendor network in Michigan. These rates and their underlying methodology will be discussed in detail by staff from Public Consulting Group, or PCG. You'll hear us say PCG throughout the rest of the presentation. PCG is a consulting firm that MRS has partnered with to develop these standardized statewide rates of payment and make subsequent rate adjustments. You'll see Mark right now in the gallery. He's from PCG. He'll introduce himself in a moment and give you some more information on PCG and their excellent qualifications for this type of work to assist MRS. A draft of the updated rate schedule was sent to everyone who was registered for this session prior to the session. So if you didn't catch that, check your email, it's there. It provides the previous MRS rates for services, for the services that we have standardized rates for, and the new rates, which will take effect on March 1st of this year. We will also be posting that document on our website and sending it as part of that follow-up email to come. After PCG discusses the rate enhancement project, a group of MRS staff, including myself, will be providing updates on other MRS programming changes to come in 2024. These include the development of an MRS vendor manual and additional opportunities for collaboration with MRS on programming implementation and changes that implicate vendor activity in Michigan. So thank you again for attending. We encourage questions again throughout. I want to stress that again. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mark Noyes of the Public Consulting Group. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I really appreciate that introduction and appreciate all the work that MRS has been doing with us over the past couple of years. So hello to everybody on the MRS partner side. As Tyler said, my name is Mark Noyes. I'll go a little bit deeper into myself and PCG in just a moment. But I am here to really help us learn about the rate refresh process, the finalized rates that MRS will be implementing starting March 1st of this year, a little bit about why MRS has moved to these standardized hourly rates so that all of you can understand a little bit more about the thinking here, the justification, some of the limitations and needs, some of the equities that need to be balanced when we're discussing rates and MRS's partnership with all of you, as well as getting deep into the weeds of the methodology by which these rates are set, including taking a look at some of the data that we used in order to set these rates. That is to say, the information that was used that we built these rates out of so that all of you can be a little bit more aware of how we came to the set of recommendations that we came to and how MRS chose to go about doing this study, as well as some of the deep underlying assumptions there so that all of you can have more information about how these rates are set and hopefully feel a little bit more comfortable with them. I can't guarantee you that everybody will walk away from this with a deep understanding of these rates as maybe one of our rate experts here at PCG would have. But I will hope to provide you with enough information that you feel that you have a deep enough understanding for it for you to continue doing the work that you do and to have the level of information that you want on these. And that's really what we're here for. It's to give you the information that you desire, the depth and the level, the complexity of information that you would like to understand these rates, what they are, why they were set, and how they were set. So with that, let's go into a little bit more about us here at PCG and who we are. PCG Public Consulting Group is a public sector focused consulting group. We work in health, human services, education, and technology with a client list that is purely public sector and not-for-profit clients all across the United States. This includes significant experience working with VR agencies all across the US, from Massachusetts to Oregon, Texas and Florida in the South, Michigan, Wisconsin, Idaho in the North. We really have worked with VR agencies all over the United States over decades of experience. We work with evaluations, system change. We do a lot of rate setting work. Michigan is not the only state that we have set rates for VR services in. It will not be the last state. It is not the first state. Currently, we have worked with Texas, Florida, Idaho, Nebraska, as well as several other states in order to set VR rates, as well as work with them on billing, payments, registrations, and other things like that, really across the breadth of VR services. This is one of the reasons why MRS chose to partner with us in order to do this project, is the amount of experience we have, the amount of experience we bring to this. I myself am a senior consultant here at PCG with a focus on quantitative and qualitative research methods and data collection. I've done tens of thousands of surveys and data collections with individuals with disabilities, the individuals that you all work with every single day. And so I'm really happy to be working with MRS to do this and to help them really work to provide rates that support the highest quality of services for individuals with disabilities in the state of Michigan. I'm very, very excited to be doing this. I'm very excited to be talking with all of you today. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of the specific goals that I have, that MRS has for this session. And the first one, the number one goal, is transparency. MRS wants it to be perfectly clear to everybody who wants to understand how these rates were set, exactly how these rates were set. That information is not a secret. This is a well-respected, widely utilized methodology that meets RSA guidelines. There is no obfuscation here, and MRS wanted to make sure that the individuals, their partners, understood the way that they were coming to these decisions, that this was not an arbitrary process, that this process is based in data, data provided by the MRS partners who it most affects, and their reasons for doing it and that these are well-justified, well-founded rates. Next, MRS really wanted to make sure that they were fostering partnership, the importance of their partnership with all of their vendors and service providers. Making sure that you have the information that you need to feel comfortable in that partnership, to feel comfortable with how MRS is going about this is key to being a good partner and to working with all of you, doing all of this to make sure that you have the information that you need to provide the highest quality possible services. Last but not least, MRS really wanted to gain insight from providers. We have been doing a lot of work with MRS's partner network in order to gain insight, to understand some of the challenges you face, understand some of the needs that you have here, and to address them. And this is another opportunity. We're here to give you as much information as possible, but we would also like to take a minute to learn about your reactions, what you want to know more about, what here you think is right, and what here do you think may need to be tweaked and looked at a little bit more. I can tell you that this is not going to be the last conversation on rates that MRS is going to have with all the providers here. It's a big one, it's important, but these are going to be ongoing things. There are going to be changes. There are going to be rate enhancements in the future. Things are going to continue working along. And we want to know what is important to you that MRS focus on first. We've gotten a lot of feedback over the prior sessions, both the in-person ones, our first virtual session yesterday. We're really looking forward to getting more, hearing more from all of you today. So with that, a quick agenda, just going into what Tyler said a little bit more specifically. The first thing I'm going to do is show you the new 2024 rates, just so that you have those and we can start our conversation off there. I think everybody's going to be very excited to see them. Then we'll go in a little bit into an overview of the project, kind of the broad strokes of how we at PCG went about this work. We'll then detail the rate build methodology, the rough process, the overall process by which rates are constructed at PCG. We'll go into some data analysis, taking a look at the actual data PCG collected, utilized to build out these rates in order to provide them to all of you. We'll make some explicit time for questions at the end of each one of these sections and at the end of my presentation today, while we outline some next steps and some future work that MRS has planned and on the docket. Now, that's one thing that I do want to mention. We're going to tackle some major challenges and concerns here, but not everything that we have heard from vendors is addressed here. Some things we are going to be talking about are things that MRS is hoping to do, planning to do, working on for the future. And we'll go into those and highlight some of those a little bit more at the end. Then I'll hand it back to Tyler, Dawn, Rodney, and they'll go over the new upcoming MRS vendor manual that will help address some of the challenges and concerns we've heard from providers over our research in the past year. But with that, let me remind you all, again, to ask any questions you have. At some points in this, as you may have noticed, I am going to get into some technical details. There will be some math today. I promise there will be some math, and I know that you're all very excited for it. However, anybody who has wrapped up the 8th grade will be able to do every formula, every mathematical process that we do here. It's really just a matter of knowing where we get the data from and how it is applied to build these rates. I'm going to work with you all to hopefully give you the best understanding of it that you can have and follow along to get you all the information on the rate setting process and the rate building process that you want to have. I'm really confident that everybody who leaves this session today will have the level of knowledge that they want on how these rates are constructed. And please stop at me at any time to ask questions. Put them in the QA in the chat. You can use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask your question out loud. And I'm more than happy to address them either as they come up or, as Tyler mentioned, at the designated spots at the end of each section. So with that, without further ado, let's hit it. 2024, the new rates. Here they are. This shows the rate schedule for all services for which PCG suggested rates in 2020. The MRS 2023 fee schedule shows the rate that MRS was providing for that service as of April of 2023. The 2024 rates column shows the rate that MRS will be implementing March 1st, 2024. There are a few rates that have fallen off the bottom of the page here. They are in the handout that is provided. Almost all of these rates have seen substantial increases to the tune of 30+% across all of these. This is a serious enhancement of these rates, that is a serious increase. We will go into some of the details and assumptions that change from 2020 to 2023 that justify all of these increases, all of these changes, so that all of you know why these were made, where these were made, and get a better idea of MRS's goals and priorities throughout this process. I will note that we do have one set of rates. The pre-ETS rates mostly stayed the same. This is because in PCG's peer state review, that I'll go into in a little bit more detail as we come up, we found that MRS was already providing rates notably higher or equivalent to peer states for all of those pre-ETS services, so none of those needed to be changed. We did do some normalization so that all pre-ETS service rates are now compensated at the same level. However, overall, most of these stayed the same. Up on the screen now, I have a set of group hourly rates. You will notice that this rate schedule for group rates is significantly simplified from the previously published schedule. This is in direct response to feedback we got from vendors who noted that the more detailed group rate schedule caused them significant financial problems when there were cancellations and no-shows among group rate activities. This more simplified schedule should avoid a lot of that issue, should avoid a lot of the problems that we heard from vendors when it comes to scheduling larger groups, allow everybody to provide group services at a much more realistic and reasonable rate, considering some of the challenges there. Now, with that, I want to move into the broad overview of the project so that you can all understand the basic steps that PCG went through, and then we'll spend the rest of the presentation going into more detail. So first of all, MRS asked PCG to assess and recommend updated rates. PCG had done these the rates in 2020 with a full rate setting project. This was a refresh. MRS had heard from vendors that there were significant struggles with the rates that had been established. MRS wanted PCG to go in and address it using a respected known methodology to provide really an immediate update to the rates being paid. That's one thing that you're going to hear me echo a few times throughout this presentation, is that MRS sought to do this as quickly as possible while maintaining a rigorous methodology that would pass RSA muster. There are many aspects of these rates that we have heard from vendors that they would like to see changed, updated, calculated differently. MRS has heard those, is working on those and considering them, but altering the methodology in a significant way like that would have delayed implementation of these current rates. But that was all heard as part of our provider feedback process for this rate refresh. We also got feedback from MRS staff. We got feedback from peer states, peer agencies, research into what they're providing for these services and similar services. And we utilized provider expenses that we collected in 2019 and 2020 as a basis for a lot of the calculations and formulas today, updated with newer information. We conducted a series of provider town halls. I'm sure that many of the people on the call listening to my voice right now attended these provider town halls, and we got a lot of feedback from them. A lot of the things that I'm going to list here are things that MRS has heard, understands, and is working on ways to address, but are not addressed in this specific presentation, but you'll be hearing more about them in the future. First of all, there needs to be more consistent implementation of policies and procedures statewide. I think that this is a significant focus of the discussion that we're going to have on the MRS vendor manual that's going to be coming up this afternoon. But there's going to be a lot more work to be done here to make sure that policy and procedure is implemented in a standardized way throughout MRS offices. We heard that that was a significant burden on partner time, resources, just to navigate MRS's own conflicting internal guidance. There was a desire for quarterly meetings with MRS leadership, more time to interact with, to learn from, and to provide feedback to MRS leadership. There was a desire for compensation related to credentials and other VR outcomes. This is something that MRS has heard and is working with PCG on to define the best ways to provide different avenues toward compensation that reward better services, not just more services. However, this runs into a lot of problems with RSA guidance and policy. We'll get into that a little bit more in a slide or two, but know that this is something that MRS has heard and is working on finding the best way to go about doing this. Compensation that facilitates vendor innovation, providing new services in updated and improved ways. Again, this is something that is much more complicated than the set of rates that we have today, and MRS has heard and is working on. Finally, of course, the need for higher rates. And I think that was addressed the slide we had up previously. Throughout this presentation, you'll see that little light bulb. Whenever we have something that we feel addresses a point that was made or a piece of feedback that we received in some of our town halls or other informational sessions, we'll try to call it out here. So with that, we're discussing the background of this product. Why did MRS decide that hourly rates and this hourly rate methodology was the right way to go? Well, really, it revolves around abiding by federal regulations and guidance on allowable costs when working with a federal grant dollars. I have the criteria up on the screen here, and I can tell you that this is a massively summarized version of what is said in that federal regulation that I cite at the top there, 200.403, factors affecting allowability of costs. Every bullet point here is a 20 to 45 minute presentation. Sometimes it is multiple 20 to 45 minute presentations. Let's take, for example, the first one. A cost must be necessary and reasonable in order to be allowable under a federal grant. Necessary and reasonable are both terms that lawyers have spent their lives arguing over what is necessary and what is reasonable. There are long definitions of both of these terms, and I have tried to cut it down to just what you need to know, but know that every time MRS makes a change in how they provide funding and compensation to their partners, they need to work through that big backlog, that big mess of federal regulations and guidelines around how federal dollars can be spent. Each change requires that. It's one of the reasons why having a reliable, well-regarded methodology is important, because it allows them to show that they are meeting these criteria. So next up, they must conform to any limitations or exclusions. You cannot use federal grant dollars on things that the federal grant has said that you cannot spend those dollars on. Next, they must be consistent with policies and procedures that apply to both federally financed and other activities. You can't charge the feds one amount and charge everybody else another amount. Everybody gets the same payment. They must be accorded consistent treatment. A cost may not be paid from a federal award as a direct cost if it would be an indirect cost for some other purpose. If you build the feds one way, that must be the way that everybody is billed for that. And we must have a methodology that shows everybody is getting paid the same amount for the same services, getting paid the same amount in the same way. They must follow generally accepted accounting principles. They may not be included as costs to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of any other federally financed programs. You can't double dip. You can't charge the feds 2 times for the same service. You can't use money from the feds to justify other money from the feds. They must be adequately documented. I'm going to take a second here. Adequately documented is a big requirement here. What RSA, the Rehabilitation Services Administration, considers adequately documented, I can tell you differs greatly from what any of us would consider adequately documented. Every step of this process needs to be outlined so that it can be reviewed and approved by RSA's lawyers and policy people, and really is a deep, detailed level of documentation. One of the reasons why MRS is using this standardized methodology is that it allows for this level of documentation to exist without burdening providers, each individual provider, showing how they arrived at the specific amounts that they would like to charge for any given service. Finally, costs must be approved during the incurred approved budget period. That is just to say that you can't bill the feds for stuff that hasn't happened yet. You can't bill the feds for stuff that happened years ago. It has to be for the current period. Pretty straightforward. But like I said, all of these are a lot more complicated than what I have on this slide now. This is just the material that I thought was most critical for all of you to understand what is driving MRS decision-making here and why MRS chose to go in the direction they did. So with that, I want to take a step back and give people room to ask any questions, to address anything they might not have understood or would like to know more about before we go forward. But I have up on the screen here a few things that I consider to be the major takeaways from this section. First of all, standardized rates comply with federal regulations. That is really the driving force behind MRS utilization of standardized rates. We here at PCG have extensive experience in rate setting across human services, including with other vocational rehabilitation agencies. Rate setting uses data that comes directly from providers who participate in the rate study process. All of our information on costs, on positions and timesheets, all of that comes from providers directly and is utilized throughout the rate setting process. We utilize those sources as well as other data sources because they align with best practices in rate setting processes. So, we have a question in the chat. Those rates in the Word document sent were hourly rates, correct? Yes, those are per hour rates, per hour of direct services provided. We will go into a little bit about how that billable, non-billable, direct service to non-direct service time is calculated and considered within these rates. But all of these are costs, are rates for an hour of direct service. Rosalind, you can come off mute and go ahead and ask your question. Maybe a little bit of a technical issue. Oh, Rosalind accidentally raised her hand. Okay, not a problem. Happens all the time. Okay. In instances where we wanted to provide the service and the MRS client didn't show up, is there compensation for the lost time incurred? These missed appointments and cancellations are one thing that we have heard from vendors a lot that is really impacts their bottom line. The answer is this rate schedule in this presentation does not address that concern. MRS heard that and asked PCG to do a study of RSA policy and guidance, as well as peer state practice around missed appointments and cancellations. We've provided those recommendations to MRS. MRS is currently working with RSA to make sure an upcoming missed appointment rate policy would pass RSA muster and guidance. I hope that that is something that you will be hearing a lot more about in the very near future. Right now, there is no change in that policy. However, that is something that MRS is working to address as we speak. It's going on in the background. I am positive that Bill Addison is currently in an argument with somebody at RSA over that policy. But for right now, there is no change in that policy or guidance, but it is something MRS has heard and is working on. Do we have any other questions or anything else I can address before we move forward? All right. With that, let's take a minute to look at the methodology here. Methodology is just a standardized practice, a way that we're going to go about doing something to make sure that it is done in a rigorous way that meets RSA guidance on how these rates need to be set, documented, how reasonableness is ascertained. So PCG uses what is known as cost-based rates. That means that we set rates such that providers match the actual cost of delivering services with the requirements of delivering them. That is, we utilize the cost that you report incurring to provide services in order to come up with the rates to provide services. So they reflect back the costs incurred. Payments to providers should be consistent with efficiency, economy, and quality. That is from the Social Security Act, which is, is not necessarily directly related. It is a kind of a guiding light for us and for many organizations when they are setting rates: efficiency, economy, quality. So our cost-based rates include the salaries of staff associated with service delivery, the taxes and fringe benefits paid to staff, operating costs such as mileage, rent, supplies, any operating costs associated with providing services, as well as organizational indirect costs necessary to operate a service provider organization that is not necessarily providing a direct service to clients. All of these are utilized and used to build up the cost-based rate. I'm going to go a little bit more into each one of those and demonstrate to you how each one of those is utilized in setting the rates that we have in front of us here today, so that hopefully you understand how each one of those factors into the final rate. As I mentioned, we use multiple sources of data, but our first and most important one is that provider cost data and service data, the information that we get directly from providers on the cost that they incurred in order to provide these services that all of you provide. We also take a look at MRS state claiming data. We look at MRS specific, Michigan specific, and federal regulations for VR services, as well as other state and programmatic rules and regulations, state and programmatic payment guidelines, rates, and that really is there as sort of a sanity check on all of us. We take a look at what other states are paying and say, does what we have when it's different, does that feel right and correct? Or do we need to do a little bit more work on this one to make sure that we are in line with what the market can actually support and demand in order for all of you to provide these rates? Or do we have to go back to the drawing board? So our rough methodology happens across 5 steps. Step 1, we take a look at the hourly wage for the direct service staff involved in delivering a service. Step 2, we analyze the fringe and benefit costs for that direct service staff. We get those from the personnel rosters that we were provided with in 2019, 2020, 2023. We take a look at the other personnel and all those overhead costs, all of those indirect costs. Step 4, we take a look at the mileage costs associated with providing an hour of service. I'm going to pause on that one when we get to it, go into a lot of detail because we've heard a lot from providers about how the way that mileage is taken into account within these rates. We want to be perfectly clear about how it is taken into account, and we would like to hear more from you about what you might prefer in the future. Finally, we'll take a look at the cost for billable and unbillable time. Like I mentioned, these are rates for an hour of billable direct service, which means that they have to cover costs that are not associated with billable direct services, and the adjustment we make in order to allow for that. So again, a little bit more on data sources. 2020, we developed rate recommendations for VR services by collecting provider information from cost reports, personnel rosters, and time studies. All of those came directly from providers. However, we realized that we were setting rates again in 2023, and some of the information present in those may have been outdated. I'm sure everybody can name a list of reasons why things are different in 2023 than they were in 2020 and 2019. So we updated and enhanced the information with some additional sources of data, including a 2023 rate study on work-based learning experiences, a market salary analysis. I'll go into exactly what that entails in a few slides. Qualitative data from provider town halls, and like I mentioned, benchmark from peer state rate studies. We have another question in the chat. When counselors ask for different services that aren't directly listed in the rates, many give authorizations under different authorized rates. Do you have something that helps to guide both MRS counselors as well as vendors to know what rates to use for specific services? Also, are vendors still needing to give rates for services above that aren't listed? Well, the vendor manual that Tyler and co are going to be talking about will include service definitions, and those service definitions are likely the starting point for determining what rate should be charged. We are aware that not every service is on this rate schedule. These are only the services that PCG made those original recommendations in 2024. As for vendors giving rates for services above that aren't listed, or for the services that are not on the current rate schedule, this does not affect current policy or practice with anything other than the rates listed for this study. So I think that that's a question that I'm going to have to turn over to MRS for any guidance or guidelines on. Tyler, do you want to jump in on that one now, or hold it for later?
Yes, there is comprehensive guidance that guides counselors and managers on how to navigate that process of looking around at what the market price is for similar services and making a determination about what that rate will be for services not listed on the fee schedule. So if you have any questions about how that's established, or that process, or how a decision was made, I encourage you to talk to the counselor in the local MRS office that the MRS customer is assigned to. They'll be able to help you out with that.
Thank you very much, Tyler. So with that, a few more takeaway notes. Anybody with questions, please throw them in the Q&A, toss them into the chat, whatever you want to do with them. First of all, again, I can't emphasize this enough. The core data here is given to us by providers. Providers who participate in the rate setting process are really the base data that we work from. Hourly rates take into the requirements of delivering a service, including the overhead of providing that service, and attribute them directly to 1 hour of service provided. The first factor incorporated into the rate calculations is the wage of the person providing the service. That is the baseline from which everything is built. We'll see how that works in a few more slides. Finally, operating costs like mileage are currently considered as part of the hourly rate, and we'll go into more, we'll explore more deeply how those are provided as things come up. Do we have any other questions, anything else anybody is wondering about at this stage before we keep moving through? All right. Not seeing anything. Let's keep going. Next, we're going to get into the data analysis section. Does standardized rate mean statewide, or are regional variation based on local labor markets permissible? I can answer that one. The answer for that is that these rates are statewide. They are for all MRS services that fall under the listed service category. We did hear that some providers would prefer to utilize more individualized and more local market rates. However, changing the methodology in such a way that it would allow for localized rates would have required a significant longer period of data collection, significantly more change, more back and forth with RSA, a lot bigger lift than updating the standardized statewide rates. And that would have meant that we were having a conversation about rate increases probably in August or September rather than in February. MRS saw the need to implement these rates being much more pressing than that. So they wanted to update the rates within the existing methodology as quickly as they could, which is why we are talking about an implementation in March instead of sometime in the fall. Well, there has been some demand for regional variations or regional rates or changes to allow for more regionality in rates. They are not currently present here, but that is something that MRS is considering and is working to see if different enhancements to take into considerations the different cost demands of regionality might be permissible, might be a way to go about or to alter the rate schedule in the future, while balancing the need for some simplicity, RSA guidance, obviously, as well as some other concerns. However, I will go into some ways that some of these costs balance out between more rural and more urban settings as we go forward, with the understanding that there are some real differences in the way that services are provided in more urban settings compared to more rural settings. So with that, we're going to head into data analysis. Like I said, here's where things are going to get a little bit heavier, a little bit more data focused, and a little bit more mathy. However, I promise that all of you will be able to keep up and that all of you will get your questions answered. If you have anything that you're wondering about more, that you need a little bit more time with, please raise your hand, ask a question in the Q&A or the chat, and we will take the time to get everybody the information that they need. We have a question in the Q&A that I'm just going to read over. Dolores, I'm afraid that I can't answer that question personally. I'm going to ask MRS to take a look at it, maybe type out an answer, or maybe we might have to get back to you with an answer on that particular question. Afraid it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. With that, I'm going to keep moving forward. Again, anybody with a question, please stop me and we'll keep, and we will get you the information that you are looking to get. So with that, let's begin with the market salary analysis. We originally utilized the hourly wages from the 2020 personnel rosters to set the wage for the provider staff. However, I'm sure that all of you are very aware that wages have been significantly impacted by some economic changes from 2019 to now. As such, PCG engaged in a market salary analysis. We looked at data sources like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, average hourly wage for the job positions listed in the personnel rosters in 2023. We also looked at job listing sites like Glassdoor and Indeed that make publicly available information on wages there, so that we could understand the wages and competition for those job titles and job categories that the individuals you would all be seeking to hire would be looking at when they were job hunting. In addition, in the 2020 rate study, PCG utilized the mean hourly wage reported by the BLS. That means that we basically made the assumption that we would be looking at an individual with that job title who is paid such that half of individuals with that job title would make less than them, half of individuals with that job title would make more than that person. MRS wanted to provide rates that were consistent with providing higher quality services to the individuals with disabilities in the state of Michigan. As such, they asked us to utilize the 75th percentile wage from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That is, assuming that 75% of people would make less than that person and 25% of people would make more than that person. That's a really meaningful difference. It's most important because this is the base number that comes in and is utilized and built upon throughout every other step. PCG utilizes what is known as the prevailing wage, which means that we look across all the data sources, that 75th percentile, the job listings on Glassdoor and Indeed, the 2020 personnel rosters, and we set the assumed wage to be the highest wage in any of the sources that we find. So we always utilize the highest possible wage that we refer to as the prevailing wage. MRS expects these rates to be consistent with providing a significantly more generous payment to your direct service staff in order to accord with recruiting and retaining the best possible staff. So here we just have a little bit of information on exactly the wages used to select for the rate build. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, just wanted to show you this. Next, I want to go into the fringe and benefits cost. The fringe and benefits cost is taken directly from the 2020 rate study and the data provided to us by all of MRS's partners who participated. We aggregated that data together and found that about 35.6% of personnel costs go to fringe and benefit costs for the provider staff. So 35.6%. Now here we have a couple of different pieces. We have the base wage costs, this 35.6%. They're puzzle pieces. I'm going to ask you to keep these in mind, and I will show you how they get built into and work to construct the final wage with each piece. But first, you got to get all our pieces laid out on the board. So we have the base wage, 35.6% of personnel costs for fringes and benefits. Next, we look at other personnel and overhead costs. The first thing we did was look at the 2020 rate study, where those were calculated to be 29.7%. However, we looked at, in the year 2023, we conducted an additional rate study for work-based learning experiences. In that, the cost reports showed a notably higher percentage being spent on some of those other personnel and overhead costs for a variety of reasons, really changes in businesses and shares of I'm sorry, I lost my word for a second. A much larger share of expenses going to those hourly other personnel and overhead costs. The rate found in the 2023 work-based learning experience rate study was 43%. MRS heard that providers were having notable difficulties and some trouble with some of these overhead costs and decided to utilize that 43% across the board, make the assumption that all service providers should be spending or would be spending a similar percentage on their other personnel and overhead costs instead of that 29.7%, so that 43%. We have a request for the hourly wages used. That is provided in the rate memo that I think will be made available through MRS's website or other parts. I don't want to get too deep into any specific table during this presentation, but that information will be provided. Next, the mileage cost. And I do want to take a second here to go over how we calculated mileage cost. In 2020, the mileage rate was calculated at $1.94 per hour of service. PCG arrived at this by taking a look at the time study and the expense data given to us by providers and determining the average mileage required to deliver a single hour of service. So basically taking a look at all the data available to us, how many miles correspond with each individual hour of services spent. So the mileage rate can be built back into that hourly rate. We updated the mileage rate used in 2023 utilizing the IRS mileage benchmark which brings our mileage rate to $2.58 per hour of service. So an additional $2.58 is built into every hour of service received. Now, I want to take a second here to call out a few assumptions, a few things that go into the background of this. The way that mileage costs are calculated here is to cover all services provided by MRS. That is to say, it standardizes the mileage across all services. Now, we understand that some service providers may incur higher mileage costs than others, depending on where they provide services and some of the specific services they provide. This abstracts away from to a notable degree. However, as I said previously, this is MRS chose to go about it this way in order to provide an update to the rates as quickly as possible in a way that they knew would accord with RSA policy and guidance. Changing the way that methodology, that mileage was calculated or compensated would have caused a meaningful delay in that. However, MRS has heard that this may not be the best way to consider mileage and that it may not meet provider needs. It is exploring other ways to better compensate and better reflect some of the realities here. I would also like to note that the differences that you will see in any rate adjustment caused by mileage are very likely going to be dwarfed by the differences that are expressed in this rate study itself. As you can see, the amount of mileage attributable to a single hour of service is pretty small, all things considered. The rate adjustments that we are talking about here, based on those differences in salary, those differences in overhead percentages, are going to be much larger than any difference that might result from mileage. However, MRS has heard that this may not be the best way to go about incorporating mileage into the way that they recompensate providers, and is exploring alternate ways to go about compensating mileage that pass muster with RSA. So I just want to take a second here, take a pause, make sure that everybody understands or feels that they have the understanding they want of how mileage is included in these current rates. If I have any questions, please let me know. All right, we'll have more time for questions at the end of this section, but for now, let's keep moving. Next is that billable direct service cost. As I've mentioned before, these are hourly rates for an hour of billable services. The billable direct service time is taken from the time study we did with actual service providers reporting in on how they use the hours in a day. When we looked at this, we found that there were 4 clusters of time usage that could really be sorted out by the service provider. The very high cluster was individuals spending about 90% of their time on billable direct services. The next cluster, the high cluster, was about 74% of their time. Then we had a moderate cluster, around 54% of time being used to deliver direct services. And then the lower group was 41% of time being used to cover direct services. Up on screen now, you will see the billable percentage for different job categories utilized or updated in the 2020 study. So we can see that somebody with a tutoring service type spends about 90% of their time providing billable services, which means that the rate needs to cover that 90% of their time, but also the 10% of time that they can't spend providing direct services. Whereas something like benefits counseling, about 41% of time is spent providing direct services, which means the rate needs to correctly consider and cover the other 59% of their time. Last but not least, while we tried to do everything that we could to update data and bring costs in line with the 2023 market, we realized that there were some things that we just weren't going to be able to update without a major new data collection effort, which MRS wanted to avoid burdening providers and partners with that, as well as to allow this to happen as quickly as possible. In order to cover for anything that may have been missed or anything in which costs needed to be adjusted for the change in time period that weren't handled by some other aspect of this methodology update, we built in a cost adjustment factor. This really is just a catch-all for inflation. We utilized the BLS's Consumer Price Index, the CPI, for the Midwest region, which contains Michigan, to calculate the 5-year average annual percentage change. The CPI is the most widely used measure of inflation that is available to us. It covers the cost of a basket of goods, looking at how those costs change in aggregate from one point in time to another point in time. We took a look at the annual percent change for the past 5 years and found that on average, prices had increased by 3.07% per year over that span. Therefore, we took that and applied it to every year since the prior set of rates were calculated, bringing us in 2024 to a 109.51% cost adjustment factor. That is, every one of these rates has been multiplied by that 109.51% to come up with a final 2024 rate that includes not just all of those adjustments and shifts in assumptions that we discussed earlier, but also inflation over that same period. We recognize this is likely double counting inflation in some areas. However, MRS consistently wanted us to make assumptions that were more generous to their partners, even if it meant double counting. So with that, we now have all of our pieces. Let's take a look at how they are assembled. We start with, let me get my laser pointer here. We start with the base hourly salary. This service, I'm just using a generic service here, has a base hourly salary of $36.82. So that becomes our rolling total here. The rolling total column tracks exactly what the rate is at after each point in the process. Next, we consider hourly benefits. We found those to be 35.59, that 35.6 figure that I mentioned before. So we take our input, our 36.82, multiply it by 35.59 to get 13.10. $13.10 of an hour of this service goes to fringe benefits. That is added to our rolling total to bring that to $49.92 an hour. Next, we do the same with other personnel and overhead costs, which is that 43%. $49.92 by 43 brings us to $21.47, which gets added into our total for $71.39 per hour. Next, we back out the former mileage rate of $1.94 and add in our new mileage rate of $2.58. That brings us to a total of $72.03 per hour. That covers the cost for the direct billable time and operating costs. We then need to cover the cost for those indirect times, those times that are not directly billable. So we take our $72.03 and divide it by 74. That 74% is our billable time. Dividing it gets us the other 26% of time, totaling out to $97.34. That becomes our new total, $97.34, which we run through our cost adjustment factor, multiplying $97.34 by 109.51% to get $106.60, which becomes our final total cost for an hour of this service, considering the base salary of the person providing the service, their hourly benefits, the other personnel and overhead costs attributable to that provider, the mileage associated with an hour of service, and the billable, non-billable time breakdown for this service. Gets us to $106.60 per hour. So with that, let's make a little bit more room for questions. But a few points for discussion and takeaway. First of all, MRS supported a methodology that provided their partners with more resources. I hope that this has been made clear throughout, that there were several points in which a choice needed to be made, and MRS consistently asked PCG to make choices that would give providers and partners more resources. These new rates set a higher baseline salary for all of MRS's partners. Well, you choose exactly how your organization utilizes the funds here and the payments and compensation made. MRS assumed that a higher baseline salary would be set. Partner feedback was critical to building up these rates. As you could see throughout this process, we did take a lot of input in and tried to reflect that at multiple points throughout this methodology. These rates have been adjusted for cost changes since data was collected. That was done through changes in the baseline wages, changes in the administrative and overhead percentage, as well as that cost adjustment factor at the end that covers inflation. Do we have any questions, any notes, anything that anybody would like to know more about before I move forward? We have another question about on-the-job evaluations that I'm going to toss over to our friends at MRS in order to handle, as that's a really specific policy and service-related question. Do we have any other questions? All right, not hearing anything. I'm going to keep moving. Outline a few next steps that MRS is going to be undertaking that we'll be working with them on over the next year or two. So first of all, MRS has developed a strategic plan to establish some priorities over the next 3 years. A lot of these priorities came directly from feedback from their partners that was gathered during this rate refresh process. First of all, one of the major goals is to build and expand collaboration with service providers. There's going to be a lot more detail on this in Tyler and Don's presentation coming up in just a few moments. But that expanding that collaboration is a key aspect. Next, enhancing service delivery, making sure that all of you have the resources that you need to provide the highest quality possible services. Rates are clearly a part of that. However, MRS does not believe that to be the end of the conversation there. Next, improving staff recruitment and retention, whether that is MRS staff or vendor staff. Rates are, again, part of this, but they're not the end of it. Building a stronger VR knowledge among their staff so that policy and procedure is applied more consistently, people get answers faster to questions, and hopefully fewer questions occur. Finally, improving employee engagement, giving employees of MRS and of your staff, of your vendor organizations, more opportunities to engage and interact with MRS, especially in the policy and guidance making process. There will be ongoing reviews of the rate process. PCG has developed a rate calculator that allows MRS to make updates to these rates utilizing well-established data sources in a much more timely way, so that future rate refreshes can happen much more quickly, with much lower commitment of MRS resources to be much more timely and responsive to your needs. So hopefully we aren't waiting long stretches of time between rate refreshes. This is not to say that rate studies will never happen again, and you will never need to work with PCG or MRS in order to provide information to set and update rates. A lot of the information that we presented here can only be gathered and updated through the rate setting process. However, these midstream, mid-course adjustments should happen in a more timely way with the tools that MRS will now have. Throughout 2024, MRS plans to explore enhanced rates for improved client outcomes. PCG is going to consider leveraging data, work to identify best practices, and explore potential models to determine the best structure for supporting quality services in Michigan. We don't know what this is yet. This could be incentive payments for client outcomes. This could be enhanced rates for providers with higher credentials than their peers. This could be a change in how mileage is calculated to better provide services to rural areas. We really don't know exactly what is going to make it into this policy and guidance here. We are going to be working with our friends at MRS, with everybody over at RSA, to figure out what can be implemented, as well as what the incentives and changes that those new rates or new enhancements might affect in the marketplace. We don't want to implement a policy that has negative outcomes for individuals with disabilities. That's the one thing that we really know that we need to avoid, even more than getting into hot water with RSA. So there's a lot going on here. We're having a lot of discussions, but it's a lot of work to implement any of these changes. So we hope that you'll stick with us, keep paying attention, keep looking out for new announcements and enhancements from MRS. So with that, before I turn it over to Tyler again, going to make room for questions one more time. I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great news. And hopefully we'll speak to our ability to get you out of here a little bit early. But with that, any other questions, anything that anybody would like to ask, know more about, please let me know. All right. I'm not hearing anything. Tyler, I'm going to turn it back over to you to get us started with the MRS vendor manual.
All right, great. Thanks, Mark. And while there's some overlap on the discussion of rate development, as Mark was saying, I'd like to kind of draw a line in your mind right now, because there is a line on our agenda that we're moving on from the discussion of our rate enhancement project, and we are going to, for the rest of the session, talk about other programming changes that we have queued up for 2024 and beyond, namely the development of an MRS vendor manual. To get us started, I would like to introduce the Division Director of Staff Development and Policy for Michigan Rehabilitation Services, Dawn Sweeney.
Thank you, Tyler. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Excuse me. I'm very excited to be able to talk about, along with Tyler, about our new vendor manual that we have been working on for quite a while. For us, it's going to be a unified document for all of our guidance between MRS and our vendors. It's currently in development. We've done a lot of work on it, but as you are aware, there are a lot of components to our vendor items. Lots of things that we have to make sure are included for our end and for our federal regulations, and a lot of questions and things you've asked us to add in for your own needs as a vendor. We have to have some very significant review of this as well, both legally and through other partners that we have, as well as eliciting, we will be asking for feedback from you all in the future. So just so you know that we've been working on this a while, and we have a ways to go, but we wanted to start this conversation with you all and make you aware of the things that we've already done. The vendor manual is also in response to questions and requests that you have submitted to us to have all this information in one area for you all to use. So we're very excited about that. The vendor manual will be our select source of communication for agency vendor information, service requirements, and reporting and payment processes. And vendors will agree to those processes through reading the manual, and we will be able to continue that communication. So go ahead. Okay. So currently, I want to talk a little bit about the ways we are currently communicating to you all. Obviously, we have our MRS vendor manual or our MRS manual, our policy items. And an example is the RSM 680, which talks about job coaching services. Right now, though, what happens is the vendor requirements and vendor information are filtered into the policies we have on a specific topic. What will happen in the future is that we will have the manual itself will be specific to the vendor's needs for all these topics and not be mixed amongst our staff manual. It'll be directed for the vendors with the vendor insight included. The other way we also communicate is through our informational memorandums. An example here is IM 2302, which is regarding vendor reporting requirements. Again, this is another way that we share information with you all. However, it comes out on its own. It's not a part of it comes to you the way it comes. It comes directly to you all. The manual itself will include all this information in the manual so that you'll have a one spot to look at for that. We may issue IMs to let you know that we've updated the manual, but all the updates will actually be in the manual and will be shared in that way. We will also be, we'll also be posting our manual for you all to be able to access and research. And finally, we have our website. And the website is great, but it can get cluttered when we're constantly adding new information for you all to be aware of. So once again, we will use the website to notify of updates in the manual, give a link to the manual, but the manual will be our main source of communication between us. The manual, we have a lot of things that you have submitted to us through town halls, through other communications that you would like to see included. Definitions, the rates will be included in there as well as the policy and procedures. So that is beneficial to both you as a vendor, but also to our MRS staff, so that there is a consistency in how we are interpreting and implementing policy. And that will allow our MRS staff to take a vendor perspective sometimes when talking about rates and payments and things like that. They'll be able to understand through the manual some of the questions you have and the reasons you might have those questions and how to help answer those. And Tyler's going to go into a little more detail about some of the components for you.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. I realized I didn't fully introduce myself at the front end of our session here today. So for those of you on the session that I haven't met yet, and I don't know, my name is Tyler Gross. I'm a policy analyst within Michigan Rehabilitation Services. Throughout my section of the presentation in this session, I am going to be discussing individual components that will be features of the vendor manual when we get to implementation. Before I jump into those components, though, I did want to emphasize what I see as the three primary benefits of this vendor manual, and Dawn spoke very well to a couple of them. The first of which being it's a source of unified guidance. So those different ways that we're communicating information to vendors, as Dawn went through, it will now just be one single source, the MRS vendor manual. If you have a question related to your involvement with providing services to an MRS customer, you'll know that's where you look, is the MRS vendor manual. Second benefit is that to the extent that MRS has statewide guidance for vendors, it will be a location for that statewide guidance. We know in the vocational rehabilitation process that services provided to individuals as identified on IPEs are very tailored to the individual. So we, by design, provide vendors and counselors and their managers a tremendous amount of flexibility on what they can authorize for in terms of services, the number of hours, what services are right for that individual customer, and so on. So we're fully recognizing a lot of the VR process is individualized to the customer, but to the extent that we do have statewide requirements, this vendor manual will be a great place for those statewide requirements to be located. And the third major benefit that I understand to be presented with this vendor manual is that it's a way for vendors to understand and manage liability and compliance. When we get federal dollars for the Vocational Rehabilitation Program, MRS, that money comes with a series of requirements and prohibitions attached to it. And when we pass on some of those federal dollars to vendors through authorization for services, that money comes with some of those requirements and prohibitions. So, and there are consequences for violating those requirements or prohibitions for both MRS and for vendors. So it's important for us at MRS and for vendors to fully understand what the federal requirements are and what the consequences for potential violations of those requirements would be as well. So those are the three primary benefits that I see for development of the vendor manual for MRS and for MRS vendors. Now I'm going to go through primary components of the to be implemented vendor manual. As I go through each component, I'm going to highlight things that are existing in MRS guidance, which is most of it. This is mostly a unification project of existing guidance to vendors into a single document. But there are a couple new processes that MRS will be introducing with implementation of the vendor manual. So when we get to those new things, I'll be sure to highlight those as new items when we get there. So component one, I'm not going to spend much time or effort on this because this is what we've discussed throughout the session up until this point: payment processes and rates. So MRS wants to provide vendors clear, consistent guidance on how much vendors are paid, how the payments processing works, and a way to contact MRS to discuss any questions related to payment processes and rates. The MRS vendor manual will not change existing payment processes in any significant way, but it will unify all of this guidance into a single document. So questions that this section of the vendor manual will address is, what is my rate of payment for services I provide? Hopefully we've already provided that information clearly today in terms of the standardized rates that we have for that set of services on our rate schedule. And in the future, when we get to the implementation of the vendor manual, that fee schedule will be part of the vendor manual. It won't be a standalone document. It will be a component of the vendor manual in this section on payment processes and rates. Another question that we will address is, how quickly can I expect to receive payment? And then also, if you run into questions like, I expected to be paid by now for something and I haven't received payment, how do I proceed? And kind of questions that come up through the course of service delivery like that, we'll have a way for you to contact a centralized place in MRS and get the information you need. So, like I said, not much time on that component one. I know we discussed it in depth already. So moving on to component two, communication channels. So MRS is striving, and I hope these virtual sessions this week and the in-person sessions that we ran around the state last week speak to the fact that MRS is striving to have more regular communication with vendors. We want vendors to know MRS policy and programming changes well before those changes are implemented, allowing vendors time to anticipate those changes and account for them in their programming development. So MRS intends to have a centralized point of contact, as I mentioned, for all vendor contact and guidance. I would also like to emphasize, in this section of the manual, we'll emphasize participation in those email subscription groups. In a little bit, on a separate slide, I'm going to talk about, if you haven't already, how to subscribe to those email groups. But it would be including that information in this section of the vendor manual as well. And then any information about scheduled public meetings that MRS has scheduled that might interest vendors or provide information that vendors find relevant to their activity and their providing of services to MRS customers. So this is pretty straightforward as well. This is stuff that already exists, but it's unifying the information into that single location, and will address questions such as, how do I make sure I stay updated on MRS programming? And if I have any questions, who do I reach out to? So moving on to the third component, yeah, a little denser material here in terms of what the vendor manual will include. So MRS sets a series of ethical standards for vendors. These are somewhat obvious items that you might expect to see in ethical standards statement, such as truthfulness, staying within the scope of agreed upon and authorized for services, not soliciting MRS customers and like signing them up for other things that weren't agreed upon. Additionally, there's this matrix of state and federal laws and regulations that dictate what MRS can do with the federal funding we receive for the VR programming, for the VR program, I should say. So we want to have a clear section in our vendor manual of what these requirements are that arise out of MRS's own ethical standards and then the legal and regulatory requirements that are attached to those federal and state laws and regulations. And these things, as you can see addressed in the questions here, they will address things such as in what circumstances, if any, is it permitted to disclose customer information? What do I do with customer records after providing services? So this is an important item. MRS has a federal requirement to hold customer records for 3 years. MRS sets an internal requirement on ourselves that is stricter than that federal standard. We hold customer records for 7 years after we submit the data to the feds associated with providing services to that customer. And that customer's case is closed. There's some peculiarities, but in general, it's 7 years. You can think of it that way. So when a vendor provides services to a customer, there's this paperwork that is associated with those services that are provided. So what happens to that paperwork once services have been provided, the agreed upon period of services has elapsed? What do we do with that paperwork? What do those processes look like? We'll address that in this section of the manual. And then third, what are the consequences of an MRS vendor violating one of these ethical, legal, or regulatory requirements? Okay, moving on to the next component here, and I'm keeping an eye on chat and Q&A. Like I said, most of the stuff is existing MRS guidance, but if you have any questions on this stuff, happy to address those. And I would expect some more questions when we get to the new items. So component 4, reporting requirements. MRS does have some statewide requirements on reporting. There are 4 instances which vendors are required to submit reporting to MRS across all services, or there's some exceptions to that, but across a wide range of services. And those 4 instances are when a vendor is requesting new or additional authorization for services, when MRS is verifying the employment status of a customer, when there's a monthly progress report being provided while services are being provided to that customer. And then lastly, when there is a final report, when services are completed and being provided to the customer. So throughout recent communication with vendors, we heard this at our in-person session last week. We heard it in previous town halls with vendors, that there has been some confusion surrounding vendor reporting requirements and what is required statewide. In particular, we heard from vendors that have a wide geographical footprint or statewide footprint, that what they hear from one MRS office might be different from another in terms of what reporting is required. We want to eliminate that. To the extent that we have statewide requirements on reporting, this will be the source of a single location for that guidance for both MRS vendors and counselors to refer to on what are the reporting requirements for vendors. So the questions that I've mentioned some of throughout this component that we hope to address are: what reports are required of me when providing services? I went through those 4 reports briefly, but the vendor manual will provide more information on those reports, as well as like how to fill them out, what data elements are associated with those reports. Second, can I use my own template or form when completing these required reports for MRS customers? The answer to that is yes, you can, but it just needs to include all the information MRS requires on our version of the report. So in the manual, we'll provide an MRS version of each one of these reports that can be used by vendors, but is not required to be used by vendors. So if you have some existing reporting system that provides all the required information, we don't want to create any additional administrative burden on vendors. And then third, we get this question a lot, and so that's why I included a rather specific question on this slide, is do I need to submit a monthly progress report for the final month of services, or is that final report sufficient for what MRS needs? The answer to that is the final report is sufficient. That counts as the final monthly report. And so just clear guidance on that question specifically will be provided in the vendor manual as well. And other, frequently asked questions related to reporting requirements, addressing those specifically in this section of the manual. The next component is critical incidents. So this is where I'm going to plant a flag and say, this is new. Not that critical incidents are new, but MRS having a formal process for addressing these when they occur will be new with the vendor manual. There's also one more section that's new that's next that we'll get to in a minute. So when I say a critical incident, what are we talking about here? This section of the vendor manual will provide vendors a way to recognize, report, and resolve critical incidents involving MRS customers. Critical incidents include things like natural disasters, disruption of utilities, acts or threats of violence. So anything that can significantly implicate the safety of that MRS customer receiving services, or has the potential to discontinue the services that have been agreed upon, whether temporarily or permanently. So this section of the vendor manual will provide a way to recognize what MRS does consider a critical incident related to an MRS customer receiving services from you. And then if these things occur, we hope they never do, but we know they sometimes do. How do we address that? How does a vendor notify MRS that one of these incidents has occurred? How does MRS go about responding to that report to ensure that it's safe for the MRS customer to resume services at that provider? So the questions to be addressed, as I mentioned, what is a critical incident? Who at MRS do I notify if one of these events occurs? And then what is the resolution process? Okay, moving on to the next component. This is also a new item. MRS is going to begin to run background checks on vendor staff that provide services to MRS customers or have access to MRS customer records. The purpose of this is MRS wants to ensure that when we place a customer into a vendor to receive services, that we are putting that customer into a safe place to receive those services. So a couple things I wanted to address about this at the beginning. When we perform these background checks, will not be going fishing for all past criminal activity of staff at the vendor sites. We will be looking for specific things that would be potentially a disqualifying finding for that individual working with an MRS customer. This will be spelled out in detail in this section of the vendor manual, but what we are looking at is violent criminal felony. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Felony violent criminal history, felony conviction of fraud, extortion, tax evasion, or other similar financial crimes, any conviction related to patient abuse, or exclusion from participation in Medicare, Medicaid, or a different federal health program. And that includes violations of the Medicaid False Claims Act and Healthcare False Claims Act. That's a mouthful. I know that's hard to digest when I just kind of spew it out in a list in a webinar format like this. So having those, we will include in this section of the vendor manual what we're looking for, what tests are being run, what background checks are being run, and the process by which that information will be provided to MRS. Before I turn it over to Rodney to discuss how MRS is going to proceed with a pilot program for these background checks on a limited basis for the pilot, I did want to address a couple questions that we have received throughout the previous sessions with vendors earlier this week and last week. And the first is we've been asked by vendors, if a vendor already performs background checks on staff, will this be sufficient for MRS's purposes? And the answer to that question is no. MRS will be conducting the background checks regardless of whether those background checks are run or similar background checks are run by the vendor on their staff. The purpose of that is to verify on our end that those background checks have taken place, and we accept the liability at that point for conducting the background checks. The second question I wanted to address is, is there some sort of a drop-off point for the past criminal activity that we're looking for on these background checks? The answer to that is yes. So anything we're looking at with the background checks will be time constrained. We're working on the exact parameters of that still. For example, with felony violent criminal history, it might be something like within the last 10 years. So setting a time constraint on how far the background checks go will be part of that process as well for MRS. We've been working with the Department of Attorney General in Michigan to develop this process and what some of those timeline pieces will be when we get ready for implementation. The last thing before I turn it over to Rodney is that I wanted to stress that if there are findings on this background checks that we conduct, it does not necessarily prohibit MRS from continuing to work with a vendor. The purpose of running background checks for MRS is not to punish vendors. That is not our intention. So if a finding does happen on one of these background checks, MRS will work with the vendor to reach a resolution in which we can continue to do business with that vendor. It might involve something like reassignment of that staff member's duties relative to the MRS customer that's receiving services from that vendor. But we will work with you toward a resolution. We know that these background check findings might even, it's likely sometimes to catch vendors off guard if they're not running these types of background checks. So just please rest assured that we will work with you to come to a common resolution. So as I mentioned, MRS, I'll let Rodney speak to the details, but we are going to get this background check process off the ground with a pilot program. Rodney, if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit to that, I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Tyler, and good afternoon. My name is Rodney Craig. I'm a manager with the Program Enhancement Division here at MRS, and I'm going to just speak a little bit about the pilot project for background checks. As Tyler was saying, within the next 90 days, MRS will be conducting or starting the process of a pilot project for background checks. The two areas that we're going to use, one is probably going to be a larger populated urban area. The other is going to be kind of a more rural area. The object there is to get our processes down pat, to get our communications down pat, and just to get a situation where we can constantly reevaluate the process. The goal is to make this as simple as possible for the vendors, but I can go into a little bit more detail of what would be in the pilot itself. What we'll be doing is notifying the vendors that they are part of the pilot project. Once that project starts, we would be sending information, requesting staffing information. So who would be subject to those background checks? They would be staff that would obviously be providing direct services to a customer, as well as staff that have access to the information. That is kind of based upon federal regulations and consistent with that. And as Tyler said, we've been working with the Michigan Attorney General's office to vet this and ensure that everything is being done correctly at that point. There will be a twofold process once this pilot is completed and we move into doing this on a statewide basis. The first will be existing vendors when they come into the system. We'll have a background check prior to being able to be authorized to at that point. We'll conduct the background check. We will do that in an extremely timely manner so that vendor can get into the system as quickly as possible. The second would be that existing vendors will have what is essentially a annual certification process. So each vendor we will do a series of background checks and go through and ensure that all vendors that are having that service, direct services, have went through the background check process at that point. And a little bit more on what would be involved in the background checks. So what are we actually checking? Tyler talked about the offenses that could pertain to having us a positive check at that point. What we'll be checking is basically three major areas. At this point, we'll be looking at iChat. We'll be looking at criminal sexual conduct reporting websites. And the other area is one that we currently are already doing that we can do in the background, which is federal debarment checks. That is a check to see if any agency or individual has actually been debarred through the governmental grant system. If so, MRS cannot transfer federal funds to that entity. It's just something we are not allowed to do. So that check is already going on in the background. But iChat and the criminal sexual databases are public databases. Couple other quick questions that we have had in some of the other events. The cost of this, MRS will be doing the cost of the background check. So we will just need the information provided to us so we can conduct the background check. In the previous slide, we talked about a resolution, and Tyler also spoke to that. One of the major resolution processes as part of the background check is ensuring that any positive discovery is, we've confirmed that is accurate. There sometimes can be, false positive cases in a background check. So we want to ensure that there's no mistakes made there as well. What we intend to see in the next 90 days will be an informational, an IM policy that will come out that will give our unit and others in MRS the ability to begin the pilot background check. Once that comes out, you'll see a lot more communication with us or from us on this process and what to expect. As Tyler said, we intend to do this in a very transparent manner, as efficiently as possible. But we want to get this process moving. One other question that did come up yesterday was regarding a notification. So what would happen? How will a vendor know if there was any positive background check discoveries? We would be communicating that with you. If there was a situation where there was no positive background checks, everything turned out okay, we will also be communicating with you. You will receive at that point what is considered our annual certification that you're had went through the background check process and no issues were found at that point. So again, within about the next 90 days, we should be having some information out for vendors, and we look forward to working with you on this. So I can kind of pause here, Tyler, and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on it. There's none at the moment, but still opportunity. I'd say we probably have about 10 more minutes of content to go through. So if you think of any questions, I think Rodney will be hanging out for a minute and I'll be here until the end. So we're happy to answer any questions about that background check pilot or proposed process for the vendor manual.
Okay.
Thanks, Rodney.
Thank you, Tyler. Yep.
So what is next? You'll see a line down the middle of the screen right now. Above that line is steps that MRS is going to take in between now and implementation of an MRS vendor manual. And the bottom steps are recommended steps for vendors to take so you can stay apprised of that development. For MRS, we are, as Rodney just said, we are going to conduct that background check pilot. It's going to begin in the next 90 days. We don't have a set time frame for when it will conclude because that depends on how the pilot goes and how much and when we feel comfortable for statewide deployment. We still have internal review to do on this vendor manual. That includes, as Dawn mentioned at the front of this section of our presentation, that includes a legal review, and that includes a kind of like style copy edit review to make sure it looks good and is highly readable. And then once we're ready and that background check pilot process has been completed and we're done with internal review and we are ready to move forward, we will engage with what's called the administrative rulemaking process. This is a formal process defined for us as a public agency. It's a way that public agencies announce significant programming changes, both to the public and to the state legislature. And part of that process is an opportunity to provide public comment on the changes that MRS plans to make through that rulemaking process. So at that time, you can stay updated on this, and I'll get to that a little more on the how to do that and stay updated in a moment. But as this continues to develop, if you wish to submit, we're happy to have any comments you have now, or if you want to get a hold of us after this session. But if you want to submit that formal public comment as part of MRS's process in developing this vendor manual or any of those components we discussed today, that will be the time to do so. Public comment can be provided in writing or in person. And when we move forward with administrative rulemaking, it's submitted right alongside of our rule changes, any public comment that we received to be reviewed by the state has a designated entity for reviewing that type of rule change activity, and it's also submitted to the state legislature. After that, after we navigate that administrative rulemaking process, which that does take quite a while to get through, we actually get to the implementation phase, and that is going to be a whole process unto itself of how we communicate our go live date with these processes with the vendor manual, both to vendors and to our staff. So a lot more to come on that. I want to emphasize here in those 4 steps, and you can see in particular with the administrative rulemaking piece, is that this is going to take a while. This is not, the vendor manual is not going to be something that you see implemented next month. That's out of the question, you know. And so if we're going to talk a little bit more on the next couple slides about opportunities to engage with MRS going forward as vendors, so this will continue to be a regular item of discussion in between now and implementation. Moving on to below the line in the second section of this slide, steps for vendors to take. Subscribe to MRS email updates. So On the MRS website, on our homepage, there's some clutter at the top right now because we have some events going on. But if you scroll down a little bit, you'll get to this 3-column layout: MRS for individuals, MRS for business, and MRS for vendors. That third column, MRS for vendors, you'll see in the text there underneath MRS for vendors, and thank you, Mark, he's doing the electronic laser pointer there, that there's a sign up here button in that text. If you click that, it will take you to the page to sign up for email updates. That sign up link is also plastered all over our website at the bottom of, I think, every page on our website, that how to sign up for those lists. So if you click that button or any of those buttons on our website, you'll be presented with a list of public subscription email lists from the state of Michigan. And one of those is LEO MRS Service Providers, which stands for Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, and then Service Providers, which is you all. So please, if you're at these meetings, I think it's pretty likely that you're already subscribed to these email updates. But if you're not, please make sure that you are, because that is a primary way in which MRS communicates programming changes and upcoming public meetings and anything that we want to go out statewide to vendors. Second is when you're available, if you're available, attend and watch recordings of future public quarterly meetings. The session we have today was 2 hours. In the future, they're probably going to be more succinct than that because we're dealing with topics that are less complex and dense than rate restructuring. Not that other things aren't important and complicated to work through at times, but rate restructuring in particular is really dense material. So this is 2 hours. In the future, we hope these sessions, and we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment on the details of these sessions, but will be an hour going forward. We'll post recordings of those to our website and send them out as follow-up using that email subscription list. So that's a good way to stay updated on MRS programming changes. And then third, as Rodney spoke to, if selected for the background check pilot, you'll be notified in the next 90 days. So if you're notified, there'll be more information about how to engage with that background check pilot process and what the steps will be for that. So keep an eye on your emails. If you get contacted by MRS's unit that Rodney represented related to the pilot, please participate to the best of your ability. It will help us as an agency make sure that that process goes smoothly statewide when we're ready to deploy it statewide. Moving on to the next slide. We have a couple different types of opportunities for vendors to communicate with MRS going forward. One is more involved and one is less involved, depending on how involved you want to be with MRS in our programming development going forward. I'm going to let PCG, because they're going to have an active hand in conducting these sessions with vendors going forward, speak to the more involved of the two options. So please, Mark.
Well, thanks, Tyler. We heard throughout our interactions with vendors and MRS partners over the past year that there really was a desire for some vendors to take a more active role in helping MRS set policy, solve problems, and build the best possible systems that they can. And this is really where the idea of the vendor advisory work group came. This would be a collection of vendors who have volunteered for this responsibility to really work to facilitate their relationship and leverage their position within MRS's provider network to identify and solve problems much more rapidly than MRS might be able to on their own. This will be an ongoing effort to identify successful practices, to identify successful stories that can be shared across the agency, as well as to look for problems and find ways to solve them. PCG is going to be facilitating this group, but we hope really that this is something that's going to be driven by vendors who want to be part of this group and to champion these changes, implement these changes, and create a positive feedback loop for MRS and for all of MRS's partners. This group's going to meet on a quarterly basis and produce a summary of recommendations for MRS leadership. We are currently looking for people to join this, so you can reach out to anybody on the MRS panel here if you're interested. There will be more information about this to come soon, but we're very, very excited about the possibility of this vendor advisory work group, and we look forward to hearing from all of you on more of it. But we do understand that not every vendor is going to want to participate in something that is going to involve, we hope, not a huge amount of time, but some significant amount of time to identify and solve some of these issues, as well as to champion some of these successful practices. And for those other vendors who may not want to participate in the vendor advisory group, there are going to be more opportunities to learn from and interact with MRS and NMRS leadership. And I'm going to give it back over to Tyler to talk about the MRS public meeting sessions.
Thanks, Mark. So this is the less involved of the two options, as Mark alluded to. We heard from vendors in the town halls over the last year, 2 years, and speaking with individual vendors, that there's a desire for more regular communication from MRS to vendors about upcoming programming changes. So this is our attempt to do that. We're going to have quarterly meetings going forward. They'll be similar to the meeting that you just attended today to discuss programming changes with MRS. Although, like I said before, we're aiming for 1 hour for these sessions in the future, depending on how much content we have to go over. The first of which of these will be in June of this year. We haven't selected a specific date yet. We're still working on establishing those specific dates. When we do, an email will go out to that email subscription list with the path to register for those sessions, as well as this information be posted on our website. So I like to frame this as some vendors have the perspective, which is understandable and we appreciate as an agency, of I just need to know the information that's relevant to me. I don't want to be involved in the development of that MRS programming and have more involved conversations about that. That's fine. And these quarterly meetings are for you then, the information sessions. If you want a more active participatory role and to make your voice heard more actively, those sessions that Mark spoke to with the advisory group is for you. So more information to come on both of those opportunities. Okay, great. We are to the end of our session here. I know we have a few questions sitting in the Q&A to address. I would like to highlight now, though, there is a QR code on your screen right now for a survey to complete. That feedback greatly helps us. It's an opportunity. If you didn't feel comfortable voicing something today or typing it into the chat, please provide that type of feedback on that survey, as well as any other additional feedback you have. We do review it extensively and discuss it as a group and factor it into our future changes. Mark also, or PCG, someone from PCG, excuse me, just dropped the link to that survey in the chat as well, if that's preferable to you rather than using a QR code. So I'm going to turn my attention to the Q&A. There are a few questions that I would like to address. I'm going to read the question and then I'll answer the question. The first question is, in the manual, will consideration be given to identifying deemed status for vendors that have achieved industry accreditation, such as CARF International? So MRS does have some requirements right now on certification and expertise level, education level in some cases, depending on the service that's being provided. That is included in our services manual, the rehabilitation services manual. As you remember, Dawn went through those different ways that we have vendor information distributed across a few different sources. So when the vendor manual is implemented, all of that guidance related to required vendor credentialing and licensure or experience requirements or education requirements, anything like that will be included in the vendor manual. Okay, second question. When will manual be available for review, since these guidelines will go into effect in 8 days? Okay, this is good. I'm glad someone asked this. This is an important distinction to make. In 8 days, or on March 1st, is when the new rates go into effect. That's what Mark discussed throughout the first section of our presentation. It's the rates reflected on the handout that was emailed prior to this session. The vendor manual that I and Dawn and Rodney discussed after PCG's section on rates, that is not being implemented in 8 days. When we are approaching implementation of the vendor manual, there'll be plenty of opportunity for public review. We're going to make a draft of that document available for review prior to that administrative rulemaking process and period of public comment, so that people can review it in full prior to our implementation of that manual. But that's somewhere pretty far down the road. With the vendor manual, we're talking, I'm hesitant to even put a timeline on it, but I'm going to say at least 6 months from now, because that administrative rulemaking process alone takes longer than that to get through. The rates, though, 8 days from now, that's what's March 1st. The third question is, how should we expect, or excuse me, how should we proceed with current open authorizations that extend past March? Are we expected to provide those services at the lower rate? Another great question. This is something we're going to address specifically in follow-up materials. And I'm set to meet with some policy folks in MRS actually directly following this session to discuss this topic. The exact specifics of this will be provided later, but our intention is that you will not continue to receive the lower rate far beyond the implementation date of March 1st. There is likely going to be a process to navigate to get that new updated rate. So that would be any authorizations issued before March 1st are going to be under the old rate. Any authorizations issued on or after March 1st is going to be under the new rate. If authorized services extend over that date, we would like to provide an avenue to provide final billing up until March 1st. And then we can authorize for services under the new rate going forward from that date. More information to come on that in our follow-up information, but hopefully that addresses the concern there. We heard from some vendors, I'm authorized to provide services for 9 months in advance from that March 1st date. And we recognize it's not reasonable to continue to provide that old rate for services being provided well into the future. So we're going to have a way to address that. There's a last question. Will those policy questions that were asked be answered before 3/1 since the rates are affected by these questions? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think we've answered all policy questions except for the one that was narrowly specific to on-the-job evaluation. I provided an opportunity to follow up with the specific to that question. That's not something that I feel comfortable answering right now, kind of firing from the hip without discussion with my colleagues in policy unit. And it's not something that I came prepared to discuss in detail today. It's an important question, so I don't want to provide you incorrect information or incomplete information. So we have your email specific to that question from the registration. We will follow up. If you don't hear from me, my name is Tyler Gross. You can reach me at grosst@michigan.gov, and please follow up with that. But again, I don't feel comfortable providing a comprehensive answer right now. All right, I think that has addressed the questions that I've seen raised in the chat and Q&A. We do have a few minutes before our scheduled end time, so I'm going to let it sit for 20-30 seconds to see if any additional questions come through. Okay, excellent. As promised at the front end, we're going to wrap up on time or before time. So if any questions arise, you can reach out to any of the folks you saw present today. I provided my contact information, and more communication will come as follow-up communication to all folks who registered for any in-person sessions last week or virtual sessions this week. So thank you again for your time, everyone, for making time to hear the information today. And hopefully the rates are exciting development for you, the increased pay in general across the board, and more information to come from us for follow-up. So thanks again and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone.